better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know.
So the data is very interesting, and I think it's valuable, and I want to share it with our listeners and with other people as soon as it's ready. But the data isn't actually the point of the edition wars. For me, For me, it was the acid and contentiousness and the bitter infighting among the community in the late 2000s, early teens about
a shadow was rising in the west.
We
could feel it in the air. Smell it in the water.
It was real nasty. And I think it's really instructive and interesting to talk about, especially now that I think we're mostly through the bad part of that. And I have some ideas about why that's happened. But so the data is important. We should reference it just in passing when it's relevant. But that's maybe a whole nother thing. But yeah, let's talk about Edition Wars. Let's talk about what we mean when we say
let's do a little introduction to this topic.
So there are multiple editions of D&D, as you are no doubt aware. Most of you are probably playing 5th edition. Some of you are probably playing 3.5 or Pathfinder. Matt and I have mostly transitioned fully to 5th edition by now, though we very recently were playing Pathfinder and still have many fond feelings for that. But each edition has its own distinct design philosophy. And somebody who's not me, because I don't particularly find this interesting, can talk about the designers behind each of the editions and like what they were trying to accomplish. But for the most part, there was a relatively smooth transition from edition to edition, first to second to AD&D, AD&D to 3, less so. 3rd edition transition was a little rocky, but people eventually got on board. But when 3.5 was replaced by 4th edition, there were some...
This was in 2009.
Thank you, Matt. This was in 2009. 4th edition replaced 3.5. And there were good reasons to phase out 3.5. 3.5 had become completely bloated, absolutely unmanageable. And if you...
It had jumped the shark, the dire shark.
It had jumped the shark. We will do another episode where we talk about some of the classics of 3.5, like Pun and, shield bashing, tunnel fighting, all the crazy builds that you could do in 3.5 that were utterly and astonishingly broken if you had enough books. But 4th edition did something that some people liked and some people didn't, but it very explicitly took a cue from video games and MMOs and tried to, in a lot of ways, gamify and structure Dungeons and Dragons in a way that it had not been before. And it required a battle mat, which no edition had done previously. Most people played with one, so it wasn't like that big of a deal, but it explicitly required a battle mat. Every character had abilities that were usable in a gamey way.
So we could get, I think, into 4th edition.
Yeah, sorry.
Into the weeds.
I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted. But
Edition Wars were from basically, and I think we now have, looking back, we now have the data to prove that what every gamer who was really into this, in which we were, was feeling was very real, is that from 2009 to probably about 2 or 3 years ago, the people who played Dungeons & Dragons were utterly divided on what rule system they should use, between people going back to old school rules, 1st and 2nd edition, or clones made by other companies, to people sticking with 3rd or 3.5 edition, to people jumping to Pathfinder, which was published by a different company, to people who switched to 4th edition. And the community was like pretty much divided into thirds, is what my data is showing. And people who were online were just fucking mean and shitty to each other about it.
Yeah, and I don't want to... Yeah, Matt's right. We shouldn't get too deep into...
But that's what the edition
to what 4th edition is about. But yeah, that's what it is. So when 4th edition split the community, there were enough dissatisfied customers that some stayed with 3.5. About, like Matt said, about a third went to Pathfinder, which was explicitly made to continue the traditions of 3.5, but fix some of the problems with it, and we can discuss whether or not that succeeded. And then people who did go on to 4th edition,
right? And Pathfinder could be termed, 3.5.5 or 3.75. It's basically create a rule set that you can, given 5 minutes, convert something from 3.5 to Pathfinder. It's basically the same with minor changes and improvements that are generally good, while the bones of the system stayed the same. And 4th edition, as I think you've got some thoughts on, was a radical departure from that, or at least it was seen as such by large numbers of people, probably about 2/3 of the community.
Yeah, and at this point, now that we are out of the trenches on this, there are arguments I think to be made for each of the editions having value, and I do think that there was no reason why they couldn't have coexisted somewhat agreeably, but it was at a time when D&D was not especially popular, not compared to the way that it is now, before Stranger Things, before Community, before Harmontown and the Adventure
Actual
Zone
plays.
and Critical Role.
And yeah, this was 2009, so it was a perfect storm. You had these competing versions of Dungeons and Dragons. This was 4 years after the launch of World of Warcraft. You had MMOs taking off. And you had online communities being in full swing, people could argue, Twitter had just launched, not that people argue about Dungeons and Dragons on Twitter that often, but there's places to argue online like never before.
Like Reddit and Twitter, and I think that probably especially Reddit and Twitter. Without going back and looking, I also think this was a time when Wizards of the Coast was undergoing a lot of internal division and struggling to find out what it wanted to be as a company, and didn't have a clear vision of what the game is. One of the strongest things about 5th edition is that it is very clearly D&D, and it has a very clear vision in mind of what Dungeons and Dragons is. And when you play 5th edition, or when you pick up a 5th edition book, it's got, a real clear design direction and a real clear theme. For better or for worse, whether or not you agree with that. But in 2009, it really felt like Dungeons and Dragons didn't know what it wanted to be. There was a companion app with 4th edition. They tried to gamify it. I don't want to make it sound like I'm too down on 4th edition, because 4th edition was fun. I played it and I enjoyed it, but it was a distinct departure, and a lot of players did not like that.
Yeah, I mean, I basically played 1.5 campaigns of 4th edition and then gave up. And I think a lot of people were in the same boat. I bought the books. I sold them now, but...
Yeah, I bought the books too. They had an Eberron campaign, which they still don't have for 5th edition, which I'm endlessly salty about. But it is typical of nerd communities to divide like this. It is not in any way surprising that this happened. I think that the reason why it didn't happen with 5th edition, or it didn't happen the same way with 5th edition, is because... As we'll talk about with the data at some point, it helped to expand or take advantage of an already expanding market. When in 2009, the market was, I think, we can take a look at this, but shrinking or narrowing, or definitely not growing, especially when competing with, like Matt said, World of Warcraft and other MMOs for players' attention.
Yeah, it's hard to know whether that's the case or not, because data on the size of the market, at least from stuff I've been able to collect, really only goes back to about 2014, which is what we think is when the market started really expanding. But yeah, the market wasn't growing, and looking at surveys of people who run gaming shops, or the sort of chatter on the internet about what people were talking about from 2009 to about 2014, so from the launch of 4th edition and Pathfinder to the beginning of the launch of 5th edition, what people were talking about and playing switched back and forth every 6 months as which is the top one, between Pathfinder, between 4th edition, between back to 3rd edition, to old school revival, back to Pathfinder. All these things were back and forth, and it turns out it made a really ugly community online.
It did. And so I had to just look this up because I couldn't remember. One of the interesting things, I think that the edition wars nobody likes to talk about them because they were annoying and frustrating. And at this point, anybody who cares about D&D has already had probably dozens of hours of conversations about Editions
You've
Wars
chosen
online.
which one you like, and that's
but
fine.
I do
and
think
good.
it's instructive, and there's a lot of things to be learned from this. So I was just looking it up. Penny Arcade's web series, Acquisitions Incorporated, launched in 2008. And I'm pretty sure they transitioned to 4th edition as soon as it came out. And
they were like a showcase.
They were a showcase. And again, for better or worse, that meant that probably the most popular video property, and this is well before Critical Role, it's well before the Adventure Zone or any of the really popular podcasts or actual plays. It was one of the first, but it was popular. Penny Arcade is huge. You know, they've got a gigantic web presence and, you know, multiple conventions and whatever. And so you had Wizards, like, sort of officially sanctioned video property playing 4th edition, which meant that a lot of people who weren't deeply steeped in nerd culture already were exposed to it that way. And I think that made a lot of, especially older gamers, pretty upset about 4th edition. I would say that...
I mean, I wasn't pissed off about the Penny Arcade people because they were playing 4th edition. I just hate the Penny Arcade people.
Well, okay, so this is
a
different issue.
They're arrogant, beyond insensitive, and just kind of generally... rich assholes who stumbled into money.
I don't particularly...
the nouveau riche geeks.
I don't particularly care for Penny Arcade any longer. That's not really... That's neither here nor there. We can have a conversation about dick wolves and other things another time, but the point I'm trying to make is that...
Suck a dick, Jerry. You're a piece of shit.
They're really
You're not that smart.
They're really lazy these days, too. They used to have some pretty...
You're right. Clarity in writing is more important than complicated sentences. Please learn this.
It's much too late for him. He has no incentive to change. It blew my mind that they still have a daily... Is it still daily? I don't know. I haven't read Penny Arcade in 5 years. Anyway, the point that I'm making here is that this sort of like reflects... I don't know. It's sort of a harbinger of what's coming for Dungeons and Dragons, right? In 2009, early 2010s. You have a burgeoning live play community and audience, but it's not there yet. And it divides the community. And the community, by the way, is still divided. I do think that the D&D is in a good place right now, and there's a lot... I've never been online and talking about RPGs so much as in the past couple of years and like not had to argue with people. Everybody seems pretty happy. But people are still divided about whether or not actual plays are good, about whether or not people like Matt Mercer are a positive influence on the game, or whether or not all these like influx of new players is going to change Dungeons and Dragons for better or for worse.
Well, and here's the thing about the Edition Wars is that, so, you know, the community completely and almost evenly divided through about the release of 5th edition up to like 2014. You look at something like Roll20, Pathfinder, starting in 2014 is the most popular game. That changes, and 5th edition has been the top dog for a while now. But the number of people who are playing 3rd edition and Pathfinder, and to a lesser degree 4th edition, is stayed pretty constant. Like, those people have not given up their games. And maybe that's an artifact of the data. Maybe they haven't deleted their campaign on Roll20 or something weird like that. But people are still playing those games, right?
Right. And this is the argument to be made, or part of the greater picture of why the edition wars, I think we can safely say, are over, or at least have subdued to a point where they are no longer a problem. You know, it's
they're like the Korean War. They didn't end with a formal treaty. It's just a ceasefire.
Exactly. We're in a ceasefire. Actually, that's a great point. I don't know if Wizards is ever planning on or releasing a 6th. What's the time frame for when they would theoretically...
Editions, at least, so, you know, 3rd edition came out in 2000, right, 4th edition came, or 3.5 was 2004, 4th edition was 2009, and then 5th edition was 2014. So it's every 5 or 6 years they like to tinker with stuff, though I don't know if that will be the case this time.
I don't know. They've really got something good here, so it would be weird for them to release an edition. But
well, this is how Wizards ended the edition war, and I think the data I've collected, which you can look at our website, www.dmofnone.com, is that 5th edition ended the edition wars not by eliminating the competition, though the number of people playing 4th edition especially has gone down, but they did it by growing the number of people playing the game.
And maybe they'll resurge whenever Wizards gets around to releasing 6th edition or advanced 5th edition or whatever, advanced D&D next, whatever it is that they're trying to call this or whatever they call next. But for now, it seems like everybody is able to occupy their own space. There is enough bounty to go around. This is the reason that I guess nerd and geek communities get so, hedgy and divisive and fighty when things are bad is that the lower that this is true in academia too, Matt, you've heard this, the lower stakes. Sure. The lower the stakes are, the harder that somebody will fight over them. Like nobody has ever had like a more contentious argument than two academics in the same field who aren't even really in direct competition with each other, arguing about something that's like barely related. But so, in the late 2000s, early teens, everybody was playing World of Warcraft. RPGs were on the downswing. It looked like maybe some of them would fold entirely. Some did. A lot of older books never came back, and that made people very, very protective of what they were playing, whether it was 4th edition or 3.5 or Pathfinder. It felt like there could only be one, and as long as people were playing a different edition, they were weakening the community and making it vulnerable. But what was really cool, and I think that going forward, one of the most interesting things about Dungeons and Dragons is trying to find out exactly what it was, why it was that the market was able to grow, and why there were so many new players ready to come on board.
That's a good point. And one of the design goals, and I think I read every scrap of information about the new 5th edition when it was, in its infancy was called D&D Next when it was being play tested. One of the design goals that the designers put out there is that they wanted to basically do the impossible, which is unite the player bases, right? They want something for people who played 4th edition, something for people who played the old school revival stuff, like basically stuff that went back to the original edition of D&D, something for the people who played Pathfinder, though they never say that explicitly. So that was the impossible goal. And looking back now, 3.5 years after the release of 5th edition, I would say a marginal success.
I would say marginal.
People
too.
still play this. But I don't know if this was, I think this is basically completely accidental. And, there are great people, nice people at Wizards, but I don't think they intended this from the design goal. They ended the edition wars not by uniting the player base, but by expanding who plays Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't think it's entirely their decisions, right? It's these outside factors of now we have streaming. Now we have these places where if you don't live with your friends, you can play online. The game is just easier to play.
It is easier to play. Yeah, it's interesting.
That's a thing Wizards did. They made it easy.
They did. So that is the main success, is they made it easy to play without dumbing it down to the point where it's not recognizably D&D. And that is challenging to do. And for me, it's still not crunchy enough, and maybe it never will be, but old school hyper nerd, and I liked all the fiddly bits of Pathfinder and 3.5. But I very much enjoy 5th edition. It works for me. It's interesting because a lot of what makes... from speaking to new players, a lot of what's appealing about the game at first, what brings them in is the art and the media, and you bring an RPG book in to like an open-minded group of people, and it looks cool. These days they're pretty fun. They don't have like that old school like painted on the side of a van art that they used to in the 80s and 90s. Now they've got like really nice, cool looking art, glossy pages. It's really fun to just flip through one of those. But I would argue that Pathfinder's books are at least... I like the art better, and I think there's like some...
Oh yeah, it's got a nice aesthetic to all of them that's all united.
So it's not... Yeah, so I think that there's definitely, I think integrating with Roll20, I think obviously popular live streams and actual plays using 5th edition, and maybe just word of mouth visibility allowed 5th edition to
I
capitalize
mean,
on.
if you know about brands, man, you know word of mouth is the most valuable way to grow a brand.
I honestly think that there's that D&D will never die because it can't. Like, there's always going to be more people.
I'll still play D&D with whatever rule book I can find, and no one can take this rule book from me.
Right.
D&D Beyond might shut down, and I won't be able to access that anymore, but this physical copy I have right here isn't going anywhere.
It's just I'm trying to think of like a comparable example from another industry, and I can't, because D&D is role-playing games for most of the populace. I could never talk to somebody about Shadowrun or Savage Worlds and have them understand what the hell I'm talking about, but I can say Dungeons and Dragons and they'll understand what I'm talking about, and that's how it is for... I don't see that changing anytime soon, which is why I and Matt and other people in the fan base tended to get frustrated when Wizards failed to uphold, I would say, their sacred duty to the property or to capitalize on obvious opportunities. They're doing better. But I think that was one of the main things that drove the edition wars, is a feeling like the company wasn't doing right by Dungeons and Dragons, wasn't doing right by their fans, was trying to expand in the wrong direction. And for a while, we talked about this, but for a while, very briefly, D&D was almost, I mean, the thing is, its market share has always been greater than all other properties combined. But there was a brief moment when it seemed like...
Almost, yeah, pretty much.
Brief moment when it seemed like that might actually change, when it might be overtaken by the rest of them, which just tells you the strength of the brand, even at the lowest point. That's how big their market share was.
And I mean, the big question I think now is looking forward, when will the player base for 5th edition stop growing? One could say it might not stop growing for 10 years, 20 years. It may never stop growing. I think a better way to phrase that question is, when will the player base for 5th edition stop expanding at the same rate it's expanding? Because it's growing fast, and I think it will always continue growing, but will it keep growing at that 10% a year or 50% a year or 100% a year speed? And will we see the sort of resurgence of role-playing games that are not 5th edition and not Dungeons and Dragons? And that's what I am hopeful for, in that in the next 5 to 10 years, a role-playing game could come out or a new edition of an old one that sees that same kind of D&D 5th edition level of growth.
This is a conversation for a different podcast, maybe, but I think that one of the things that has allowed for this to happen is the either retirement or, stepping back of gatekeepers from the industry, and the destigmatization of Dungeons and Dragons, basically seeing it on TV. That's everything in America. It just hinges on the visibility of things on television, and I'm not joking. It is our cultural touchstone. It is the thing that drives what is normal in America. And being able to see it on Community, having Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert talk about it, having Stranger Things be popular, just removes one of the largest barriers to people being willing to try it. And that, combined with just the fact that some of the old guard are just too old to keep on fighting, is making it available to a generation that is ready for it and wasn't able to break in before.
Well, and so this is transitioning to a new topic. Because you brought it up, I think this is something we have to talk about, because it's been in the news in the last month. There's a lot of shitty people out there talking about this word gatekeeping. And there's a lot of good people talking about it on the other side of the fence. So a little context here is that for the first time in a while, Wizards of the Coast has hired a new designer. This new designer's name is Kate Welch. She's an insanely popular member of one of the Acquisitions Incorporated streams. She's worked on a million different game designs, a lot of them in video games, very successful video games. And she's a great player and DM of Dungeons & Dragons. She's insanely qualified for this job.
This is demonstrable because she does it on air. Like, nobody can deny that she's...
There's proof.
There's, video proof that she's good at the game, because there's hours and hours of video of her playing it, which is the
Plus,
craziest thing.
She has 10 years of experience in game design, which is something for someone who doesn't already work at Wizards of the Coast, something that's really hard to get.
It really is.
Right? So anyway, the reaction from the community to her being hired is been, I think, overwhelmingly positive, except for some people who reacted and sort of shown the worst side of the Dungeons & Dragons community.
Matt is correct, and I have been heartened because the response to Kate's hiring has been overwhelmingly positive, both from Wizards, who have gone to the mat for her repeatedly when she's been attacked by certain sectors of the community, but just from the community in general. Most people seem very excited to have her on board. She's very qualified. They recognize that she has a lot to bring to the table. But like Matt said, there is absolutely a small and unfortunately very vocal portion of the Dungeons & Dragons community that does not like her for various reasons. All of them invented, I think, though it seems to be that their main objection is that she's not a, I get, what did Mike Merle say? Something about rules crunchiness. Or...
Well, so here I have it right here, and yeah, I think Kate's a wonderful hire. My only objection to her is that she hangs out with the penny arcade people, which I think they're pieces of shit. But whatever, I don't begrudge her that. It's a great way to. If they invite me on their show, I'd probably go.
Of course we would.
But
By the way, penny arcade people, if you're listening to our podcast, we love you and we'd love to come on your show.
That's actually false. I walk that back. Fuck you, penny arcade. I don't watch you anymore. Changing my mind. All right.
So, sorry, Mike Merles.
So Mike
said something
Mike
about
Merles
Kate.
tweeted this out a couple weeks ago, and he said, and this is quoting now, "Funny how many of the same quote-unquote fans who insist on gatekeeping via rules complexity and lore density
That's what
also have a problem with women in tabletop gaming. Hey guys, you're all fired from D&D. Find another game."
And that's the wild thing, is that she's very obviously qualified. She's a great designer. She's a great player. But because she doesn't adhere to like a very specific type of player, one that is obsessed with rules complexity and lore density, to the exclusion of all else, that she's not qualified to be a designer. And this is the traditional gatekeeping. This is the fat bearded man, no body shaming, I'm just saying they're usually fat, but the bearded man at your local game store who asks you a bunch of questions about D&D if you don't look like the type to play. The people on message boards who rant and rave whenever somebody comes in with an insufficient encyclopedic knowledge of the rules. These people, and as I was saying before, I think are fading out just because they're being outnumbered, or because they're aging out, or because maybe they're just tired of being grognards. I don't know. But it is obviously still a problem, and it's unfortunate. And I think it has been the number one thing for the past 30 years stopping Dungeons and Dragons from reaching a broader audience.
Right.
Is people like this who not only make this happen but explicitly want it to happen. And this is the most unfortunate thing about nerd culture, is this happens in every.
And let's talk about what exactly the idea of gatekeeping is, because I think not all of our listeners, everyone here has probably experienced gatekeeping in one way or another, but might not be familiar with the term.
I am Vince Clortho, Keymaster of Gozer. Volka Sildro, our Lord of the Sabulia. Are you the gatekeeper?
Hey, he pulls the wagon. I make the deals. You want to ride?
Wait for the sign, and all prisoners will be released. You will perish in flames! You and I will be the gatekeeper!
What an asshole.
Was gatekeeping?
Well, gatekeeping is exactly what it sounds like. It's keeping people out of the hobby, or providing a set of expectations or challenges to overcome to be considered a member or be a part of the community. And this happens not just with nerd stuff, it happens with sports too, but it happens
everywhere.
But it happens especially badly with things like D&D, and comic books is another bad one, science fiction and fantasy. And it generally, the truth is that generally that this is aimed at women, because there's an inherent cultural expectation that women don't know about nerd things. And so when I or Matt might walk into your local store and just sit down at a table, nobody would ask us to recite any like weird lore about Dungeons and Dragons, but if a woman did it, there is a non-zero chance that will happen, that somebody will ask her a bunch of questions about Dungeons and Dragons to make sure that she belongs. And the crazy thing is that generally there is no right way to answer that question. Even if you demonstrate encyclopedic knowledge, it'll just make the gatekeeper angry. And that's what's really unfortunate about it. It's not actually about setting a standard. It's just about keeping a certain type of person out.
And I mean, basically, this certain type of gatekeeper have weaponized, I think is maybe the right verb, weaponized, as Merle said, rules density, lore density, and rules complexion against them, which neither of them, rules complexity and lore density, neither of these are essential or in fact things that you should really want when you're actually sitting down at the table and playing a role-playing game, right? What I think a large number of the fans have done is basically spun off this tweet from Mike Merles and say, and they're all sort of responding in bad faith. They're like, Mike Merles is against having lots of lore. Mike Merles is against having rules that can have complexity. They're like, no, this man works at Wizards of the fucking Coast. He's for both of those things. He's against having them weaponized to keep people out of the game.
There have been a lot of, as Matt said, explicit.
There's lots of people like, Mike Merles, you're the real sexist for saying women don't like complex rules. I'm like, oh my God, you are. There's no reason to respond to you because you're in bad faith. But
these are explicitly bad faith arguments that nobody would ever fall for, but they're just designed to signal to a certain type of person. The lines have been drawn. So at the end of the day, what Matt and I are getting at is that things are moving in a very good direction. I think that D&D is more, and we've talked about this previously, we'll talk about it again, but more accessible and more popular than ever before in a good way. It is I think in a very healthy and positive way, been opened up to a big chunk of people that wouldn't otherwise be interested, but there is still very unfortunately loud and on occasion influential. I don't think any like particularly big creators are in this camp, but a lot of the stalwarts of the community still are. And this group of people who are pushing back against this new influx of people, and that is for those of us who want to see the hobby grow, who want to see new people come in, new ideas come in. It is our responsibility to make them feel welcome and to try to push back against this regressive old guard. Of which, by the way, Matt and I are probably part of the old guard. I think the growth in Dungeons and Dragons is very likely.
If you were playing before 2015, you're probably part of the old guard now, which is great, but it's up to us old guarders to not ruin this game for everyone. Exactly. Which is entirely possible. I can see it in the realm of possibilities, a very unlikely one where the old guard destroys the D&D renaissance.
Yeah.
Or not renaissance exactly, but exponential growth of the player base.
And I don't think that will happen. I think that there's just like way too much enthusiasm for it now for anything to slow that down.
Well, that's a good question. If you're a member of the old guard, or even if you're not, what can you do to avoid gatekeeping-like behaviors? What is the opposite of gatekeeping?
That's absolutely right. So this is sort of similar to something that we talked about way back in an early episode, but it's about saying, well, part of it is about saying yes to things. If somebody new comes in and they don't maybe have a great idea of how D&D works, or if they're not exactly up to date on the rules and they have a character idea, or they have something that they want to try, or they want to run a certain type of game, don't say, no, that's not how things work in D&D. No, you can't be a purple dragon mancer or whatever. Say, okay, yes, but here are some ways that we can make that happen. And then you try to guide them, within what's possible within the rules, or make homebrew adjustments where possible, but you try to make it possible for them to have fun and move the game forward, or build the Dungeons and Dragons that they want to play in. And it's about being accepting to different types of people. And for Matt and I and people who want to see this grow, that's very easy. It's not easy for everybody. If you've only played with the same group of 5 dudes for 30 years, it's probably going to be kind of weird for you to include young women or, people of color or whatever. But it doesn't have to be. If you all like Dungeons and Dragons, that is the easiest thing to bond over in the entire world. The greatest thing about Dungeons and Dragons is like everybody has this very chunky point of contact to work through. Like it makes it very easy to build a group of people who can get along if you're all focused on the same game and the same idea and working towards the same goal.
So here's the example I would give. This is from the perspective of a dungeon master, right? So you can weaponize rules complexity. Say you have someone who you want to exclude from your game. You could weaponize rules complexity as the dungeon master by throwing complicated things at them, leaving them to hang, all this kind of stuff. For a new player, let's say if they're a woman or someone who hasn't played with you before, and you know what, they will probably not be back, and they will in 2 years not be dungeon mastering their own game. But you as a dungeon masters can do the opposite of that, right? If there's a part of the rules that are complex, right, it's your job as the dungeon master to just interpret the player's wishes and wants into roles when necessary. And then boom, all this rules complexity is gone. Your player who is new that you want to include will learn the game as time goes on. In 2 years, they'll be their own dungeon master. So, the opposite of rules complexity is sort of taking the responsibility as the DM to make sure they learn it instead of throwing it at them so that they come up against the complexity, make bad choices, have a bad time, fail, and leave.
It's a good general rule that you want your players to succeed. And so the opposite of gatekeeping is to just ensure that all of your players succeed equally. And that if a certain player, no matter where they come from, comes in with less experience than others, then you perhaps give them a little extra help or attention where necessary.
And succeeding doesn't mean that all your players hit a monster on attack all the same amount of time. Is that something happens that is the result of their consequences, and you're not being a dick about it, right? Because new players can have fun by failing and seeing that they're worse at something than someone else and being like, oh, this is fun. I can see how I can improve in this game and do things better next time. It was fun that I was the new guy or
right.
New girl.
You want everybody to have fun. You want everybody to feel like they had an impact, whether it was positive or negative. You want everyone to feel engaged. And that's what's so frustrating, is to not gatekeep is very easy. All you have to do is try to make sure that everybody feels included, which is what every DM should do all the time anyway. And it's just a good general rule.
And here's the other sort of way I see gatekeeping in gaming communities. Merle's mentioned lore depth or something like that. And yeah, you can do the same thing with new player or players. You could just throw so much lore at them that they're overwhelmed and they can't understand what's going on and they're bored and they tune out, right? Whereas players who you want to keep around or you want in the hobby have been around long enough that they know all this stuff. But it's your responsibility as the dungeon master, again, from a dungeon master's perspective, is that you get to teach the players the lore of your world and they get to discover it. And if you and that's the non-gatekeeping way to sort of bring lore at people. The other thing sort of related to lore I see with gatekeeping that dungeon masters or players will have. Imagine that if you come in to a game and let's say you're a woman at a table and then every sort of thing you encounter is looks like something out of fucking heavy metal, right? A bunch of just like, there's a bunch of damsels in distress in bikinis or something like that. Or I come to this game store or gaming room and there's a bunch of posters on the wall. And I'm not saying that's like, you need to be prudish. That these certain art and lore are designed to keep women out, right?
And that's why most recent D&D art has, in my opinion, rightfully so, moved away from bodacious babes in chainmail bikinis or whatever, and towards functional, reasonable armor. Like, it doesn't, like, you can still have beautiful men and women in your books without putting them in a chainmail bikini. It nobody's saying that you can't have fun. No one's saying you can't be sexy, though. I don't think you can, by the way. I've never seen it happen in D&D, but some people say you can and have fun doing sex things in D&D. I've never seen it. I think it's impossible, but I have heard other people talk about it. Anyway, this is off the topic, but that kind of thing does make people feel uncomfortable, and it is a form of gatekeeping. But we've been going on for an hour, Matt, and I kind of want to put a bow on this.
Right.
This whole
is a bigger conversation that has to always be
it's
ongoing.
good. I'm glad we talked about this. But I mean, the whole thing that we talked about today, both the edition wars and the gatekeeping, I think it's a little inside baseball. I do hope that our listeners get some value out of this, because I think that it is so interesting to look at what has happened to Dungeons and Dragons in the past 3 years especially, but maybe 5 to 10. And it's such a positive example of a community growing in a healthy way. Matt and I obviously think that D&D is a great game and a fun activity, but also like a really cool way to bond with people and to build social connections. And I think that it shows maturity in growth in a community that is not traditionally known for a lot of maturity and growth. And I think it's a very...
Hey, what do you know? 40 years in, Dungeons & Dragons is finally maturing.
It's finally maturing. It did take a while, but I think it's a hopeful example, right? I think that it shows that, this is a post-Gamergate world, so like, we've seen how bad gatekeeping and sexism and general exclusionary behavior can get. But I think that the general push is in the opposite direction, is being more inclusive, is bringing more people into the hobby, is trying to accommodate people's concerns and feelings and try to build a better hobby. And I think that
we've finally got to the place where I am more popular for being a dungeon master than less. Don't drag us back to the dark days.
I can finally tell people that I'm a dungeon master. I can tell people about my D&D podcast, and it doesn't feel weird. And it's nice because there's nothing like inherently extra nerdy or weird or bad about Dungeons and Dragons. And it's so nice to be able to talk to people about that and share this thing that is fun and exciting and has been such a positive influence on our lives with other people.
Keep solidarity, not gates.
All right.
Don't do it.
Anything else you want to cover?
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Love you guys. Thanks for all the reviews and tweets.
Yes.
Keep them coming. We would appreciate a review if you haven't done one yet. Otherwise, if you have any questions or want to get in our next unwanted advice segment, send us an email at dmofnone@gmail.com.
And you can find us on Twitter at dmofnone.
Oh, yeah.
We'd love to hear from you. Happy adventuring, everyone, and we'll see you next time.